dudes? One time I was thinking about weight, and then I was thinking about glory, and then, for a while, the concept of glory weighed on my mind.
Isn't it so stupid? Oh, fiddlesticks, I use the S word. When you're at the gym and you're pulling the hardest weights, and then you look up and no one notices?
Not everything's about you, Holly. Welcome to the Two Retired Homeschoolers, a podcast where we talk about books.
I'm Holly Matthews, and my life lesson is that if you find yourself in the unfortunate situation in which you are trapped in a dungeon with a child to raise who knows nothing of the outside world, and you undertake this task of teaching him of said world by drawing pictures of lakes and rivers and mountains, make sure you go the extra mile and bring some colored markers so the child doesn't think that the world is made out of literal pencil lines.
And I'm Rebecca. Forget the chicken. What I want to know is, which came first, the owl or the egg?
Okay, first impressions. My thoughts going into this book, I'd never read it before, and I do consider myself to be a Lewis reader. Like, he's one of my favorite authors. I was surprised to find this was probably the hardest of his books to read as far as nonfiction. With fiction, it would be Till We Have Faces, but with this book, I guess it's because there were so many abstract ideas that he was, like, vaguely making references to in his effort to explain another abstract concept. It was a lot. But I did like it, and, you know, having this podcast as my motivation for reading it really helped me focus, I think.
Yeah, and I'd read it before when I was sick and in the hospital and not remembering things very well. So I remember like a few of the essays that really stood out to me when I first read it, but a lot of it was completely new reading it again. I would agree with you that it's one of the more like dense.
I also went into this book not realizing that it was a collection of essays, and so, you know, the first essay is titled The Way to Glory, like the title of the book, so I was like, all right, we're diving right into this topic, this is great. And then the second essay is Learning in Wartime, which I'm like, okay, we're diverging a little off topic, but that's all right. He's going to bring it full circle like he always does. And then we go into Why I'm Not a Pacifist. And I'm like, you know, I'm really not drawing the connection at this point. But, and I just kept telling my brain, it's like if someone was trying to teach me how to build a house and I had no concept of what, like, building a house entailed. Like, I didn't know what plumbing was and lighting and all this stuff. And so they just started teaching me all these more technical details involved. And I'm just like, dude, like, why aren't we just focusing on the fact that we need to slap up boards, like the outer structure of the house? Like, I'm so confused. So I was like, well, he's just going to bring all these random parts together and it's just going to fit all beautifully in place. And I trust Lewis. And it didn't really happen that way. Which, to be fair, he didn't write any of these essays except maybe The Way to Glory with the intent of, like, compiling it into a book.
No, most of them were speeches he gave either to churches he was invited to speak at or like graduation ceremonies or debating societies. And then he just stuck them all together because they vaguely have to do with glory. Maybe.
Yeah, some of these we're not so sure about. You want to dive into the first essay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so that's The Weight of Glory. Reading this book has made me realize how little I actually understand about what glory even means. Because I still don't feel satisfied in my knowledge of glory even after reading this book.
Well, okay, what I thought was really interesting was when he talked about how, like, we're promised that if we, you know, take up our cross and follow Christ, we'll have this, like, eternal reward after we die. And it seems kind of mercenary for that to be your main reason for being a Christian. But it's not mercenary to desire the reward that is the proper, like, consummation of what you're pursuing. Like, you're not mercenary for wanting to enjoy poetry in another language. And that's, like, what you're thinking of while you're learning the language. Because that is the proper reward of what you're doing. And so glory is the proper reward of the Christian life. It's not like God is saying, okay, if you're a good little person down on earth, I'll give you like treats and gold and some mansions and some really cool cars when you get to heaven. what you're pursuing on earth, what you get in heaven, is the consummation of that pursuit.
Yeah, but at the same time, it is very odd to be like, I'm doing this for my reward in heaven. I literally heard this story of like my sister encountered this lady who was like doing some charity work. I don't know what she was doing exactly, but it was like goodness to some extent.
Goodness.
Yeah, and someone asked her, like, I don't know exactly how this went down, but she was asked like why she was doing it, and she was like, well, I'm gonna get a crown in heaven for it. And I was like, what an odd, because, like, yeah, that's great, but also what an odd thing to, like, actually strive for, you know? So any final thoughts on The Way to Glory? This one is more clear-cut on how it relates back to glory. I mean, I don't think we need to do any explaining there. That will change very soon.
I can read the quote I wrote down about how the concept of humans as people destined for glory should impact how you treat them, because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, go for it. I really liked that point.
So he says, "It may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics." Have you read Emma by Jane Austen?
No, I know the story, though.
Okay, well, do you know the character Miss Bates?
I think if you described her character, I might.
She's the one, she's like kind of poor, but Emma goes to like visit her and stuff sometimes, kind of out of duty, because she's very boring and she just talks on and on about stuff.
No, okay, I don't know about this character.
Okay, well, that line made me remember it. Like, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to. And in the book Emma, there's like a scene, I think it's the picnic on Box Hill, where Emma says something to Miss Bates, where Miss Bates all of a sudden realizes that she's been boring everyone with her talking. And it's like the most uncomfortable scene. Like, it's horrific to read or watch or anything, because it's just so awful, because you see Miss Bates get her feelings hurt, but you could so easily also see yourself being in Emma's place and saying something like that, because she's just so boring. I don't know. I feel like that scene illustrates that point really well. That, like, just because Miss Bates is, like, a caricature in your mind almost. But, like, no, she's still, like, a human being.
Yeah.
And you don't think about it when you're just interacting with her until you, like, mess up, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I like that scene. I hate that scene.
What do you think of the quote, "Respect is treating someone according to their potential rather than who they are currently"? And that's like a summary of it, basically, and I don't know who said it, but...
I don't know what it means.
So to draw a comparison, it's like, if I were ever to meet the Queen of England, and she's only on my mind because she just died. God save the king. But yeah, if I were to ever meet her, like, I would have all this, like, awe, you know, and just, like, respect, and, like, I would never talk to her like I would a sibling, and yet my sibling is just as valuable as the Queen of England. In fact, they're both way more valuable than I am consciously aware of on a daily basis, you know? Mm-hmm. And there's people in life, like, yeah, I don't respect as much because of their behavior or whatever, and it's like, but I don't want to treat them according to how I think of their behavior. And so that's why it's like, respect is treating someone according to their potential. Like, everyone has the potential to be infinitely, like, noble, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I always think of, like, basically, respect is earned, love is not. So you should love everyone, but you don't have to respect everyone. You should respect the people who deserve your respect.
Although you should treat everyone with respect. I think that's what... No, you shouldn't necessarily respect everyone's behavior.
I think, like, to me, that's not respect. That's courtesy. But I don't know, because it's true that everyone has, like, this infinite potential. And so if you're like, I don't respect them, maybe you should respect them, but I still don't.
Okay, learning in wartime.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorite ones, just because the idea of it is applicable all the time, and it's something I thought about through my entire childhood. Yeah.
And actually, I think this quote kind of summarizes the chapter up pretty well. If men had postponed the search for knowledge and beauty until they were secure, the search would never have begun.
Yeah, exactly. Because in the essay, he's addressing some undergraduates at college during World War II, and he's basically like, we kind of have to think about the fact, do we have any business going to college, learning stuff, creating stuff, when the future of Europe is in the balance? And that extends to life. Like, do we have any business doing these pursuits that are clearly of secondary importance when, like, people are going hungry, people are dying, people are not Christians, everything. There's always some crisis that should be solved, and it's technically more important than you getting good grades in school, or even going to school, or even writing music if you're a musician, or whatever, you know? And his answer is basically that, like, it is.
I think it kind of goes back to, like, the balance of life and, like, how God created us to imagine and create, and that's, like, fulfilling a sort of importance that's removed from, like, the temporal, practical, very immediate needs.
But even then, you could say that, like, you should be doing evangelism 24/7.
Because, like, I've literally thought of this as a kid, just sitting at the table doing homework, and I'm like, why am I not digging wells in Africa right now? Like, why is this important? So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, because he addresses that question in a way that I think is, like, yeah, that makes sense.
Short little takeaway. Happy work is best done by the man who takes his long-term plans somewhat lightly and works from moment to moment, quote, as to the Lord.
Yeah, that's good.
Which I'm like, that actually draws back to glory too, because it's like more, how do you give glory to God?
Yeah, like running for the lions.
Okay, I suppose I should explain that. So I was in a cross-country team for many years in my life. It was a Christian team, and they would always be like, okay, now why are we running? For the glory of God, you know? And that was just like the most vague thing in the world. And I remember actually being like legitimately frustrated by that term, because I'm like, okay, the only real reason I'm running is like to be with my friends and to like for my own physical health and just like for the experience, you know? Like, I don't really know what this even means. Like, yeah, I'm like thankful that God gave me a working body. Like, am I only ever giving God pleasure from my running when I'm like actually consciously acknowledging some sort of praise? Like, I didn't know what that meant.
Well, not if you're, what's his name, Eric Liddell. Wait, have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Chariots of Fire. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, because in that movie, it's not like he's like praying while he runs. He's just like, what does he say? When I run, I feel God's pleasure.
Yeah, which is kind of what this quote is saying. Like, just deriving pleasure from what you're doing is like kind of giving glory to God in its own way. Because God is deriving pleasure from it, you know?
Mm-hmm. I really want you to read The Mind of the Maker, because that's a really interesting book too. And she talks about, like, it doesn't matter if art is explicitly Christian. If it's explicitly Christian, but it's bad art, that you didn't try to make good art, that's offensive. But if it's like good art, you're a craftsman. God entrusted you with this craft that you do, right? So you need to produce good work. And if you're producing good work because you know that this is what God gave you to do, and so you're doing your best at it, that's doing it to God's glory. So it's the same with anything that you're like good at. If God gave it to you, it respects someone when they give you a gift and then you make the best use of it that you can. So I feel like that applies to running as much as it does to writing or making tables or whatever.
Yeah, like even stuff that isn't explicitly Christian. Like one of my favorite rappers who happens to be a Christian, NF, he writes secular music. But I think it's still like, I think that music still glorifies God, even though it's not like, oh, Jesus the whole time.
Yeah.
For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23, people always say that. Probably because the Bible says it. But okay, so when I was reading that verse within the context of this book, it kind of made me look at it a little different. And I'd always like read the glory of God in this, like that specific phrase as God's perfect standard. But then I was like, well, if we've fallen short of the glory of God, that would insinuate that like at some point we were like within the confines of the glory of God, almost as if it's something we shared with him. And then I was trying to like think of any examples of like the glory of humanity. And this memory came to my brain. I think I was in like, I don't know, like 9th grade or something. And it wasn't even like a school assignment. I was just reading my sister's textbook on how like the baby develops before it's born and all that. And this is rather emotional, but I literally, okay, it was the weirdest thing. All I was doing was like comprehending the factual analysis of this process. Like, it wasn't like I was searching for deeper meaning behind all of this. And like, I was just like completely taken aback, and I literally like teared up. And I don't get emotional like this a lot, but I was like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy. Like, it was like I was overwhelmed, and it was a completely involuntary reaction. And I think in that sense, glory is just like, simply put, like life being the way it should be, you know? And something as simple as that is the way life should be. And well, and it's like a literal miracle. There's like there's some aspect of it that science just doesn't really like.
Well, yeah, like what causes life to actually go.
Yeah.
And what causes human beings to be more than simply like highly functioning chemical reactions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can we have thoughts that mean things?
Exactly.
All we can say is that like neurons send signals. That doesn't explain meaning. Why I am not a pacifist is the next essay. Do we have any thoughts about this one?
My main thought on this one is I really don't know how this points back to glory. I can read you the quote that I think sums it up the most. This, then, is why I am not a pacifist. If I tried to become one, I should find a very doubtful factual basis, an obscure train of reasoning, a weight of authority, both human and divine, against me, and strong grounds for suspecting that my wishes had directed my decision. What were your thoughts on it?
I don't have any.
Let me ask you this. Are you a pacifist?
No.
Wasn't there, like, something about it, though, that, like, you were like, he didn't address this, which I feel like is the main reason people are pacifist.
Yeah, he didn't address the kind of pacifism that doesn't believe in self-defense. To me, that's the only valid kind of pacifism. I mean, like, you can disbelieve is the wrong word. Mm-hmm. We can all accept that wars happen, but you cannot believe in, as in you don't approve of, any given war. Like, the war may be just or unjust. But if you disapprove of a war simply on the grounds that it is a war, and don't admit that there are some just wars, then that to me doesn't make sense. Unless you simply don't believe in violence at all. Because if you believe in self-defense but not in war, that's just a logically incoherent position. But there are some people, I'm pretty sure, who believe, like, turn the other cheek, right?
Yeah.
And they take that to the point that, like, it doesn't matter what someone does to you, you literally can't do anything back to them. You can't defend yourself, basically, by any physical means. And I don't know, I would really like to see someone address that view. Because to me, that view is at least logically consistent. But also, like, just crazy.
Yeah.
Like, I can't imagine thinking that.
Yeah.
But I respect people who do and who live by it, because that's not a fun thing to believe.
Well, and it's like, what do you say to a person like that? Like, no, you should hurt them.
I guess my objection to that is, like, they probably believe that because they believe that, like, I don't know, human life is sacred. They don't think you should do violence to another human. But you're discounting your own humanness.
It's like, you're a valuable human,
You're valuable, too. And so if you, like, don't defend your own self, you're kind of complicit in the devaluing of a human. That human is you, so you don't feel like it's that important, but it is.
You're letting a wrong occur, like, without resistance.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I would say to someone, is that, like, I do think it's obviously sometimes the mature and the good thing to do to not respond to people with violence, even if they're being violent, but there's nothing wrong with responding to people with violence to protect yourself or someone innocent. And I think it comes down to the fact that every human is valuable.
Like, being a victim doesn't do any good to anyone.
Exactly.
Including your attacker.
And I understand that you're, like, protecting your own conscience, but I think your conscience is wrong. But C.S. Lewis didn't address that type of pacifism, so I was kind of disappointed in that essay.
Well, and he did address, like, the whole passage about turn the other cheek, which I did like.
What did he say about it? I don't remember.
He more chalked it up to, like, revenge, I think. Like, it being a matter of, should I hit this person back and, like, get back at them, versus, like, a matter of self-defense.
Right. Okay, yeah.
Okay. Transposition.
All right, Holly, give us all your thoughts.
This was the hardest read out of all of them, I think, and it's really hard to explain, so going to start out here by reading a whole paragraph that I think understands the concept of transposition, which is like symbolism but a little different, and here's why. If we can imagine a creature who perceived only 2 dimensions and yet could somehow be aware of the lines as he crawled over them on the paper, we shall easily see how impossible it would be for him to understand. At first he might be prepared to accept on authority our assurance that there was a world in 3 dimensions. But when we pointed to the lines on the paper and tried to explain, say, that this is a road, would he not reply that the shape which we were asking him to accept as a revelation of our mysterious other world was the very same shape which, on our own showing, elsewhere meant nothing but a triangle? As soon, I think, he would say, "You keep on telling me of this other world and its unimaginable shapes which you call solid, but isn't it very suspicious that all the shapes which you offer me as images or reflections of the solid ones turn out on inspection to be simply the old 2-dimensional shapes of my own world as I have already known it? Is it not obvious that your vaunted other world, so far from being the archetype, is a dream which borrows all its elements from this one?"
That's like the part in the silver chair with the green lady underground talking to them about how Narnia and the world overhead is only a dream. It's the lamp is there's no sun. You just saw my lamp and made a better sun. There's no lion.
I vaguely remember that. Also, I think the most interesting part, honestly, was the overall example he used, which was speaking in tongues. He actually opened up the essay talking about how he's embarrassed about the concept of tongues and how it doesn't make sense to him and how what the Bible says about it and all that. And he says, like, it very much appears like these people are just hysterical, which I also have never really understood speaking in tongues, and if it were to happen, I'm sure it would make me feel uncomfortable if I were in the room. But then he makes the argument, like, applying the concept of transposition to it. Here's a quote. "Those who spoke with tongues, as St. Paul did, can well understand how that holy phenomenon differed from the hysterical phenomenon, although, be it remembered, they were in a sense exactly the same phenomenon, just as the very same sensation came to, and this is some author, Pepys, I think, in love and the enjoyment of music and in sickness." So basically, I think what he's saying is, like, yeah, talking in tongues basically is hysteria. Like, your body is undergoing the same physical functions that would occur if you were undergoing actual hysteria. But it's induced by, like, a spiritual concept rather than, like, a reaction to just insanity.
That was weird to me because I always thought of speaking in tongues as like what the disciples did at Pentecost.
Mm-hmm.
When they spoke in like actual languages that they didn't know but other people did.
Should we also read my favorite quote from the book that happens to be from this? It really doesn't have as much to do with what I wanted to talk about, but I just love the way this sentence sounds. "But for others, the conception of that vision is a difficult, precarious, and fugitive extrapolation from the very few and ambiguous moments in our earthly experience, while our idea of the negated natural goods is vivid and persistent, loaded with the memories of a lifetime, built into our nerves and muscles, and therefore into our imaginations." I just had to, like, reread that so many times. Is there anything you wanted to say about this essay?
No.
Okay, one more thing. I've read so many quotes from this, but it was my favorite. This was I think this is probably my favorite analogy C.S. Lewis has ever used for anything. In this passage, he's talking about how people just look at the physical world and don't see the deeper meaning behind it. "You will have noticed that most dogs cannot understand pointing. You point to a bit of food on the floor. The dog, instead of looking at the floor, sniffs at your finger. A finger is a finger to him, and that is all. His world is all fact and no meaning."
Not every dog is that dumb.
Yeah, cats are smarter, though. Is theology poetry?
That's an interesting one. Because I started out just kind of like disagreeing with him on a kind of not important level. But he's basically talking like, is theology just, poetry? And he's like, well, if it is poetry, it's not very good poetry because it doesn't have the same grandeur as just like pure monotheism. Mm-hmm. Well, it is monotheism, but you know what I mean. And it doesn't have the grandeur of like pantheism, and it doesn't have the like delightful complexity of paganism. But to me, like, the Trinity is not aesthetically unappealing. I actually think it combines the grandeur of pantheism with the complexity, because that's too simple. Mm-hmm. But if your world is just littered with gods and goddesses and fauns and elves, like, it's just a clutter. Mm-hmm. I think that the Christian idea of the Trinity is actually aesthetically appealing to me. I'm different than C.S. Lewis, but I did not relate to that at all. And also he talks about how the evolution myth, this tragic irony where somehow the chemicals birth life against all odds, the millionth chance. And then somehow that life survives and man eventually evolves. And against all odds, he survives, and this continual progress, and man goes on getting better and better until he's basically a demigod. And then in the future, though, no amount of evolution, no amount of progress, no amount of human exceptionalism can stop the sun from eventually burning out, can stop the heat death of the universe. Humanity will die, and then the universe will die. And so it's this great triumphant tragedy to him. It's like a very appealing as a myth.
It's like, why? Why does that appeal to you?
Exactly. That doesn't appeal to me at all. I will say that like Norse mythology is one of the most appealing to me on an artistic level. So there are tragedies that are appealing artistically, but evolution is not one of them. I mean, I just think evolution in itself is just kind of like lame.
Like the Christian story is so much more interesting.
Yeah. But apparently not to C.S. Lewis. And he didn't grow, I mean, he grew up, well, he became an atheist at a pretty young age. And he grew up in that time when everyone was like, science, science, science. So I get that he was steeped in that myth from a young age and in his young adulthood. And we were, on the contrary, steeped in Christianity. So that might have something to do with it, but yeah.
I wonder why it is that we get a certain sense of satisfaction from, like, sadness, and why it is that some tragedies appeal to us and others don't. Like, there many, I would say most of the Shakespeare tragedies just straight up, like, don't make sense to my brain. Like, why would you write this?
Yeah, do you know Macbeth?
Yeah, that's the only one where I've even slightly been like, okay, I guess, like, there is a fulfilling
Macbeth should not
element.
be called a tragedy, because the hero of Macbeth is not Macbeth. The hero of Macbeth is Macduff. It's like a villain origin story, and then the hero who does it. Macduff is who's awesome in that book. And also Lady Macbeth, she's a great villain. But she's not the heroine. Macbeth is not the hero. It shouldn't be called a tragedy. Because he doesn't start out good to start with. He's always this like weak, spineless, power-hungry man.
Yeah, I guess I never thought about it that way. I feel like it would actually be not as interesting of a story, though, if it were to only come from Macduff's perspective. Maybe villainous ways just fascinate me more. And I want to, like, randomly insert here, the gospel itself is not theology. It's, like, the thing of which theology is formed about. But I do find the gospel story to be the most artistically brilliant. It's the best literature achievement out there. The traitor, the resurrection. I feel like
the tragedy and then the turnaround where the tragedy becomes triumph at the end. Yeah, no, it's really good.
And it includes so many different threads of, like, people's stories within the main story, which I always appreciate in a good story.
And, like, the build-up is good, and the build-up even to his birth is good.
And then, like, Pilate. Like, he's a really interesting character, and it's not like he's just, like, this evil guy, which makes it so much more interesting. If the gospel wasn't even true, I would still find it so aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, me too.
But I find it even more aesthetically pleasing because it's true, simply because of the resurrection. Like, to me, because I believe the resurrection is true, no other story that tries to duplicate a resurrection theme, which I've read many, it's like, it just doesn't fulfill me. Like, it all just seems so cheesy, because it's like, okay, but that doesn't actually happen. But it did actually happen, and that's, like, what's the most crazy part about it that just sets it above anything else in my mind. I did have one question for you from this essay. I'll just read it to you. Unless we can be sure that reality is the remotest nebula, or the remotest part obeys the thought laws of the human scientist here and now in his laboratory, in other words, unless reason is an absolute, all is in ruins. Yet those who ask me to believe this world picture also ask me to believe that reason is simply the unforeseen and unintended byproduct of mindless matter at one stage of its endless and aimless becoming. Here is flat contradiction. They ask me at the same moment to accept a conclusion and to discredit the only testimony on which that conclusion can be based.
Yes. That's the other thing I love so much about this. That puts it really well. You have to believe in the validity of reason if you're going to believe in any conclusion arrived at by reason. But if you believe that we evolved by chance out of chemicals, and that there was no divine hand guiding that evolution, then why are these chemical processes in your brain reliable? Why can you use them to reason? How are your conclusions any more valid than someone saying random syllables? You know, like the chemicals in your brain drive both processes.
My question is this logical if theoretically you could remove the why and you were just like, yeah, like maybe it is possible that, which I don't think it is, but in a world which it is possible that like consciousness could randomly emerge from chemical reactions, and that consciousness just happens to perceive reality in accordance to what reality actually is.
That could, like, say that could happen, then you wouldn't have any guarantee that that is what you were perceiving. Like, you would have no guarantee because you just happen to evolve. You would have no guarantee that the way you perceive reality is actually in line with reality. It might be, but it might just be the way that your brain evolved,
right?
And the chemical processes that go on in it that direct your thoughts along this line. Because it's a purely physical phenomenon, you can't connect it to anything unphysical, like reason or spirituality.
So you can't put any confidence in it.
Right, you can't put any like, sure, maybe in addition to the millionth chance that you evolved consciousness, you also evolved consciousness that can reason according to objective reality.
Mm-hmm.
But you have no way to verify that, so you can't trust what you reason.
That's a good point. Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. Oh, and Is Theology Poetry is the one that has that famous quote about, like, I think it's at the end. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.
Do you know how this essay relates back to glory?
Is theology poetry? Yeah, it basically relates back to, like, should we take the idea of glory seriously, or is it all a metaphor?
It's aesthetically pleasing.
The Inner Ring. I really like The Inner Ring. I first read That Hideous Strength, where he has a character who actually penetrates further and further into the inner ring within the inner ring within the inner ring, until he realizes, wow, this is not as worthwhile as it sounds, even though you have that desire. And then to read this and, like, read C.S. Lewis's actual thoughts, where he's like, yep, I was doing all that stuff where I portrayed that social ambition. Like, that is, I meant to do that. Like, because when I read that book, That Hideous Strength, I don't know, it was very much how social interactions occur. Like, I see that playing out among people. And to read that, yeah, C.S. Lewis saw that too. He actually thought it was one of the inner rings are necessary, perhaps not even a necessary evil, but the desire to be inside of them, it can drive you to do bad stuff. Mm-hmm. And it will drive you to never have satisfaction and to always value the wrong things and to lose friendship.
Yeah, and you don't get any actual sense of fulfillment of it. Like, if you could accomplish a sense of security about your position, then that would be more of a fulfillment. Whereas if you're constantly just having to endure the threat of, like, the inner ring moving on without you.
And whenever there's another more inner ring, you're always going to want to be inside of it, so you're never going to be content where you are. Yeah, except the funny thing is I see that happen in people, but I have only the barest understanding of it myself. Like,
because you're a unique case.
But truly, I think it's just my personality is not super susceptible to that. Well, I love how much C.S. Lewis values friendship. Like, where he talks about how, like, yeah, but if you just try and do a good job at your work and hang out with the people you like, you'll eventually form your own different sort of inner ring where the exclusivity is accidental and it's just you guys like each other, and so you spend time together doing stuff you like. That is so valuable to me.
And it's not based on the exclusion of others,
right,
which is kind of the key thing.
And, like, yeah, so, like, why would you want to be inside the inner ring? Why wouldn't you just want honest friendship? I don't know, but people really, like, being outside, being left out bothers people. And it doesn't bother me as much, and I think it has to do with just, like, well, I know I was talking to you about this another time, but the part in Mere Christianity where he talks about how there's two kinds of pride. And there's, like, vanity, which is obviously pride, where you care what people think and you care about how you appear. But sometimes you can inoculate yourself against vanity by means of another and worse pride. The kind of pride that's like, yeah, I don't care about the opinion of that rabble. And that's how I am. I try not to be that way, but my personality definitely tends toward, it's easy for me to be like, yeah, why do I care about their opinion? Like, yeah, they don't matter. And so I don't have a problem with vanity so much, but rather with that kind of pride. And so it's with the inner ring, it's kind of the same idea. Why do I care about their little club? Like, their little club is honestly stupid. And I'm not just saying that out of bitterness because I'm not inside of it. No, like, I don't want to be inside of it. It's stupid. Like, to hang out with those people, I just have no desire to be with them. They don't appeal to me as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think that it's not necessarily a good thing that I'm immune to the temptation of the inner ring. It just means that I have a different problem. I do think the concept of the inner ring is very fascinating and just very important to keep in mind when you're thinking about people's psychology.
Yeah, I remember being in a situation where basically there was a group, and I don't want to give any specifics, but it just kept like reoccurring in my life that I had to be within this group of certain people. And I never, like, and it was years, I never felt connected to any of them. It was just this ongoing monotony, and it was honestly draining. And I had several different coping mechanisms I, like, saw myself slipping in and out of. And one was just, like, to compensate for the fact that I cared about being left out. I was like, I don't care what they think. Like, it's so stupid that this is even a thing. And I don't know, like, I basically experienced every sort of pride and insecurity within that situation over the span of several years. And I guess the best place I came to was, like, not judging them and just being like, it's okay. It's okay that I don't connect with them, and I don't need to, like, and it's also okay that I don't really care about, like, getting their approval, you know? Mm-hmm. Like, things weren't always that way, but I got to that point. And so, yeah, I basically got to a place where I wasn't, like, bitter, but also I wasn't denying the fact that it was a sad situation. So I think that's honestly the best place you could get it. At least that was the best thing I got to. Yeah, my favorite quote from this one: unless you conquer the fear of being an outsider you will remain.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
All right, membership. This one, I have so many favorite quotes from it. If an Augustine, a Vaughan, a Traherne, or a Wordsworth should be born in the modern world, the leaders of a youth organization would soon cure him. That's my very favorite one. And even where the planners fail and someone is left physically by himself, the wireless has seen to it that he will be, in a sense not intended by Scipio, I don't know how to say that guy's name, never less alone than when alone. We live, in fact, in a world starved for solitude, silence, and privacy, and therefore starved for meditation and true friendship. And he put that really well, I think.
Yes.
And that's why I don't listen to music in my car. Oh, and this one. A sick society must think much about politics, as a sick man must think much about his digestion. To ignore the subject may be fatal cowardice for the one as for the other. But if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, if either forgets that we think of such things only in order to be able to think of something else, then what was undertaken for the sake of health has become itself a new and deadly disease. And that makes me think of, like, the founding fathers, like George Washington and people like that, who, like, were obviously super involved in politics. And then George Washington was like, no, I'm going to retire peacefully to my farm. And then people were like, no, be the president again. And he was like, okay. And he was like, okay, I'm done now. Like, he didn't really want to be focused on politics all the time. He wasn't, like, a career politician in the way people are now. And a lot of people back then were like that, where, like, it was, like, their duty to do a bit of politics and kind of do their bit and be involved for the health of their society. But that wasn't, like, their whole world. Like, there was so much more important in the world than that. That was, like, what you have to do so that you can do the important stuff.
Like, in order to be your best in some area of life, you have to, like, balance it with the other areas of your life and make sure you're being well-rounded.
No, that's not what I meant at all. I mean, that's a good point, but that's not what I meant at all. I'm thinking specifically of politics.
Well, yeah.
But that's still not what I meant. I'm not saying that you have to balance politics with the other areas of your life so that the other areas of your life are better. I'm saying that politics is a necessary evil, and you have to pay attention to it, or the other areas of your life will, like, die. You won't be able to do anything with them. So you want to spend time on those things, because those are the things that actually matter. But to protect the existence of those things, you have to engage in politics.
Right. I just represented all your listeners, and now they understand so much better. I'm just telling myself that instead of the other thing. Okay. Do you know how membership relates back to glory?
Membership. Oh, yeah. Well, I guess so, because he talks about how it's not members of a collective, as in we're all like soldiers A, B, C, D, E, F, and G in the army of the modern world. We're like organs in the body.
Mm-hmm.
Christ is the head. We're the fingers, so we do this. This person is the shoulder, so they do that. Which is such a good analogy. I mean, it's straight from the Bible, obviously. It's a good analogy. But, like, if you think of people in a church and in a healthy society, in any case, they're members. They each have their different functions, and they're valued for their differentness as well as for their sameness.
Yeah.
It's not about just, like, complete rugged individualism. Like, the individual is important, but it's about the diversity of each individual.
Yeah.
But not the diversity of groups. So everything works together with its assigned purpose, and the purposes are different than each other. And yeah, I thought that was a really good way of saying it, and that's basically like how God made us, so that technically ties into glory. This essay has the part I disagreed with the most in this entire book in it.
Okay.
It has the part where he talks about, and I didn't write down the exact quote, but like, he basically says we need to get rid of this dangerous error we've fallen into about like the infinite value of the human soul. We have zero value apart from God. Christ didn't die for us because he perceived some value in us. And I agree with that statement, right? Like, Christ loved us even though we didn't deserve it. But to get to that point by saying we have zero value except as we reflect God. No, God invested us with value.
Mm-hmm.
We're made in the image of God. That's actually really important. And I don't know why he felt the need to say it. Well, he was saying in The Weight of Glory how every human being is like a potential immortal splendor or everlasting horror.
Like, you'd almost be tempted to worship them as gods.
And now all of a sudden we have zero value. So you also have value as a soul because God invested you with it.
And like, sin doesn't really have anything to do with that value. Like,
exactly.
No matter how much you sin, it can't touch that. So whether you're sinless or you're like imperfect, you still have the same amount of value.
Well, what makes a person who in the end rejects God so horrible? The fact that they bore the image of God, the fact that they could have been something else. Something that's already just like a dirty rag on the ground, that's not a horror. Something that's originally created to be beautiful and infinitely valuable that has been corrupted to the point of complete separation from God.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you get something truly horrible, rather than just something that you would step on and wipe off the bottom of your shoe.
Yeah, like Satan was once an angel, you know?
Yeah.
Well, and also he was like, you have zero value apart from God's perception of your value. And it's like, God's perception of my value is like the only perception that matters. Like, that equals reality.
Yeah.
I don't care what a random communist dictator thinks about my value. Like, if God perceives me as valuable, that is the only perception that I will hold to.
Well, the last one is a slip of the tongue. Did you write down the part where he said what his slip of the tongue was? Because I think you should say that.
Yes.
I think it's great.
Okay, so basically he said, so what he was supposed to be praying was, increase and multiply upon us thy mercy, that through being our ruler and guide we may so pass through things temporal, that we finally lose not the things eternal.
So that's the important part, that we may so pass through things temporal, that we finally lose not the things eternal.
But he said the reverse.
He said, that we may so pass through things eternal, that we lose not the things temporal.
And then he was like, oh, that was silly. And he was about to move on, and he was like, wait a minute. Did that come from, like, something actually kind of significant that I haven't recognized in myself? Like, do I actually desire
to pass through the things eternal so I can get back to those temporal things?
And then he describes, like, what I think probably all, if not most, Christians have. I know I certainly do. Where it's like in those moments of conviction that you're like in church or just like with other believers or even by yourself, and it's just like, you know, you're having a moment basically, and you're like tempted to say all these things or like promise this commitment or whatever, and then you're like, wait, hold up, I don't know if I want to do this, because once this wears off, like I'm gonna regret that I made that decision.
Yeah.
Which I have totally done. And then he goes on to say, that's not entirely, like, wrong, because it is true we can make irrational commitments in a moment of emotion. And it's not even within God's plan for us to, like, do whatever we
Yeah, like,
think.
maybe we're, like, in this worship service, and it's like, okay, and we're like, okay, I'm signing up tomorrow to be a missionary in Africa. And maybe that's not exactly the kind of commitment God wants from you.
Exactly.
Maybe you should take care of your kids and stuff.
So, and I think the antidote he proposed for this was basically just practice.
The antidote they always propose. Yeah, but basically he talked about how we always want to reserve a little of our own. We don't want to give our full self to God.
Mm-hmm.
But God doesn't want 7/8 of us. He's kind of all or nothing.
Yeah, and the reason for that, which I think is, like, he summed up beautifully, it's not just like, oh, God is like a power-hungry maniac who just like wants all our attention all the time. It's like, no, for it is not so much of our time and so much of our attention that God demands. It is not even all our time and all our attention. It is ourselves. Skipping down a bit. For he has, in the last resort, nothing to give of him, or nothing to give us but himself. And he can give that only insofar as our self-affirming will retires and makes room for him in our souls.
Yeah.
So it's basically, it comes down to the interaction of love, which I think lines up with glory beautifully. So now we're going to do like glory from a biblical perspective really quick, and we're going to wrap this up. In light of everything we just discussed, how would you like apply this verse differently? I sound like a devotion leader. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God.
Oh yeah, that like fits right in with slip of the tongue. Slip of the tongue is the other one that I remember really well from when I read The Weight of Glory the first time. Because it like really struck me. I was like, yup, that's me. And honestly, I don't know, because as he discussed in Learning in Wartime, it's not about spending literally every second of your day praying. It's about like everything you do is committed to God, kind of. Like literally something I've been trying to do, practicing, honestly, ever since I read this book for the first time. Like when I write, I don't know, I've tried to pray so much more about my writing, where it's like I want to write well, and I want to write the kinds of things that are good to write, but I also want to write what and when and how God wants me to. Mm-hmm. So to me it's kind of like continually seeking God throughout the process of doing it, so that I am continually secure in, this is what I should be writing right now, this is how I should be writing it, and this is the purpose for which I'm writing it, and the purpose for which I'm writing it is always for whatever purpose God has in mind, to the point that like if I ever am like, oh, I really want to write this but I feel like I shouldn't, I want to be so sunk into trying to just dedicate every aspect of my writing to God that I go with, nope, I've given my writing to God and I'm going to take it where he wants me to. And to do that, I definitely have had to give up. I'm still ambitious, mm-hmm. but I've had to give up that like need to one day be a famous writer. Like maybe I will be a famous writer one day, and I'll work hard at my craft, but like I can't have that need where that is my driving goal.
I was in a place in my writing career, which is a very official way of putting just a hobby. But anyway, I was like, I literally could not write unless I had the motivation, like in the background of my brain, like I might become famous someday, or someone might read this and really think I'm intelligent for reading it, or like I literally couldn't write without that motivation, which was like alarming to me. But I didn't know what to do about it. Mm-hmm. Like, no, just stop feeling that. That doesn't work.
But does praying about your writing work? Or have you not gotten past that yet?
I would say I'm better off than I was before. Like, it's definitely a work in progress. I don't know if I'll ever fully get over it.
And it's not, I don't even know if it's fame exactly. But it's about being, like, such a good writer. And I need to pursue good writing because that's what God made me to do, not because I want to be that in myself.
Well, and also like whenever there's something I'm really interested in, I'll find I'm like super impressed by the smallest little things, or like I'll pay attention to stuff people won't, and it'll bring me so much like satisfaction, and I'll like talk to the person who created it and be like, oh my gosh, this is so brilliant. and they're almost like a little overwhelmed by my overwhelmedness, like, oh, okay. Like one time there was this ballet my sister was in, and I'm not even particularly into ballet, but I do love like dance and music, and when you match the dance to the music perfectly, and then there's like, especially if you line it up with like a theme throughout the story that just flows so well with all the different like technical elements, that to me is just the best thing ever. And I remember going up to my sister and be like, oh my gosh, that was like literally incredible. And it's almost like she was like taken aback, because that's not most people's reactions. Most people's reaction is like, yeah, you danced well. And it was like I was taking everything into account and noticing stuff because I happened to care about it. And I actually do the same thing with my own writing. I find that I'm happiest when I've written something and like I go back and I notice all the little things I did, and I like, it's literally not even like a conceitful thing. It's just like, oh my gosh, God, like this is so amazing.
I mean, I don't think it's conceited to delight in the work of your hands.
Yeah.
As it were. Like, to create something good and be pleased with. Well,
and to realize that that's the way God made your brain.
Yeah, exactly. You're made in God's image. God literally goes, he creates the world, and he's like, that's good. Like, so if you're doing the same thing, that's not wrong.
Okay, I just like listed a couple verses going into this that like I didn't understand with what I knew about glory. And so I'm going to read them off and see if they strike me differently after talking about all this. So John 17:4-5. I glorified you on earth. This is Jesus talking to God, the Father. I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. And it's like, wow, that's a lot of glory. I have no idea what that means. But I tried substituting the word love in for glory, and this is how it reads. I loved you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. And now, Father, love me in your own presence with the love that I had with you before the world existed.
That is weird how well that works.
Yeah. Okay, another passage I thought was interesting about glory. And this is actually one of my favorite stories from the Bible. I feel like it's very underrated, but it's from Exodus 33. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. So that's earlier in the chapter, verse 11, just to give some context. Then verse 17. And the Lord said to Moses, I will do this very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name. Then Moses said, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Then the Lord said, there is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. And I was like, that's interesting, because verse 11... way up there in the chapter says the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend, and later like that couldn't have been literal, because later it's like anyone who sees my face is like destroyed, you know. So there must be a difference between like, I guess, the sort of intimate interactions God was having with Moses on a regular basis that was described with the metaphor of like speaking to him face to face versus like literal glory, which is weird that like glory is like almost like a tangible thing that can put human bodies to death.
That makes sense, though, if you think of it in terms of transposition.
Mm-hmm.
If it's like it's so overwhelming that the physical manifestation of that is your body's like...
like trying to shove a 3-dimensional thing into a 2-dimensional world. It's just going to send the 2-dimensional world into overdrive and just be like, we can't handle this, like a computer freaking out.
Tune in next week for our next book. Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to the second episode of the Two Retired Homeschoolers podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at Two Retired Homeschoolers to be updated every time we upload a new episode. Please remember to rate and review and/or like and comment.
You can also email us at tworetiredhomeschoolers@gmail.com. Join us next week for Can't Stop Thinking by Nancy Collier.